All right, guys. Welcome to the River meeting. I'm actually more than I thought I'd be for okay, so please bear with me. So yeah, we just wanted to we're gonna write a commercial, all of this with River Continuum Concepts presenting tonight on invertebrate bug monitoring on River River. Caitlin Bourne will give us the water report.
I'm Caitlin Bourne. I work with Montana DNRC as a hydrologist at Fauna. I manage the Upper Big Hole watershed, all the stream gauges, and the GAA program. Every month we get a stream flow and report the watershed.
You can go to the next slide.
I always put this up. This is DNRC's Stream and Gauge Explorer. You can find it on that website. This is where we have all access to data from real-time and seasonal stream gauge sites, not just the Big Hole, but statewide. Current stream flow, all the stream gauges on the Big Hole River are in ice effect right now, so no data is being derived. Snow water equivalent, this was yesterday's percentage. It was 87% of median values, so that's 1991 to 2020. I think it's at 89 today, so we got some good moisture. These are all the 8 sites, snow-tail sites that they use to calculate basin-wide index. Dark Horse Lake is at 19.1 feet of observed snow right now, and Matt Norberg always says that if it's 30, it's gonna be a good year. So hopefully we get to. On the right is the Hipsami SWE for the Big Hole. It's generated by the Montana Climate Office, and basically what it is it's a map, or it's a way to display where snowpack is based on elevation. So 6,000 feet to 10,000 feet. The gray is median climatology, 2004 to 2025. And then the blue is where we're at right now. It's just another way to show where it's. Precipitation, we're at 86%. It's probably higher now. Same median values, and then same snowfall sites. This is the water year standardized precipitation index made by Montana Climate Office. The Big Hole watershed is right here. And as you can see, we're kind of at baseline for indices. Climate outlook, we're in La Nina right now, but we're going to be phasing out March through May. It's a 60% chance that we're going to go to ENSO neutral. I also saw some talk that they may be transitioning into El Nino pretty quickly, like beginning of the summer. And historically, when that has happened in Montana, most of the watersheds have gotten large precipitation events throughout the summer. Hopefully that happens. The 8 to 14 day outlook, we're going to be above average temperatures and near normal to above average precipitation, and then seasonal temperature and precipitation, which is February, March, April. We're going to be cold and above average. This is the drought monitor map from the week of February 11th. The Big Hole watershed is right here. So currently it says we're in D2 severe drought, but we have been climbing out. We were in extreme drought last month, and so it's looking pretty good. That's it. Anybody got any questions?
First, like you can
That's that.
Yes.
He's on the
Let's see. Get back there. Back on the SWE.
There's some observed data, but there's just not like hazard.
Oh, you have to go.
yeah.
I'm not sure what when they what the time period is to.
Is that showing now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know. I don't
Both sides.
I don't know what the I know. It has to catch up with all the other sites, not causing on that. Sure. No, but you can find it on the Bengal Watershed Committee's monthly meetings. And I can also send it to Erica who wants that and can distribute it out. Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Caitlin. Next up, we've got Pedro to give you guys the director's report and also just to update you on everything that's going on.
Hello, everybody. Happy to try to report on pretty much everything here. The major thing that's happening for us is happening all around the country is the big freeze. In the interest of government efficiency, basically all of our federal dollars, a lot like everybody else, federal dollars are all frozen up. I'll read off kind of what set this all off. So basically a memorandum on February 6th for the heads of executive departments and agencies. So basically the US government, the gist of it is that the administration is saying that US government gives significant taxpayer dollars to NGOs, and many of which are engaged in actions that actively undermine the security, prosperity, and safety of the American people. It's the policy of my administration to stop funding NGOs that undermine the national interest. That's the language. I put the red highlight there because I think that's kind of the gist of what has precipitated a lot of the funding freeze. So heads of every agency have been ordered basically to comb through their grants and their programs to make sure that everything that's being funded is within the administration's kind of purview. Instead of sort of slowly going through and fine-tooth combing, going through item by item, a lot of just stopping funding in general has happened. So that affects us in several ways. Our work with the Forest Service at the Elkhorn mine and the Eastern Pioneers Conifer project, basically we've been told to not do anything on those projects for the time being until things resolve themselves. With the BLM and Eastern Pioneers Conifer encroachment work, same thing. Our project managers at the Bureau of Reclamation, I asked them for guidance on our watershed restoration planning grant, which is, what I'm hoping to spend a lot of my time this year doing. I was told we have no guidance to give you right now. They basically don't know. Folks are kind of caught flat-footed in a lot of spots. And then similarly for Fish and Wildlife Service money that's coming through the Nature Conservancy with our Smith Sage Springs design, we were told, and I'll get to this, we have contracted, well, we haven't contracted, we selected a contractor to begin the design on that project, and we basically can't contract for that yet until, again, we have more certainty. So that's been a little bit, it's out of our hands. And I think a lot of people are feeling the same way. We're seeing funding cuts immediately. We've heard of seasonal and temporary employees at the forest and at the BLM have lost their jobs. I heard recently of about 40 employees at the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest lost their jobs. So that's real and, totally out of our hands at this moment, but has a lot of implications for conservation work if these things indeed are persistent. So that's on the federal level. I'll get into some of the planning work that's been going on. We had something pop up from Butte Silverbow planning department. Basically, they got a request for a variance on a building. Well, it wasn't really a building. It's just a small little laundry room, basically, that somebody wanted to put on their house. As she was new to the job and as she was reading through the regulations, she came up on this review committee that was put into every county's process. And this was work that the Watershed Committee did years and years ago, basically so that every county, when they get a request for a variance on floodplain building, that all the counties would review that application and that variance request together. Basically, I think it's really great idea to have all the counties sort of looking at development in the Big Hole with the same eyes, and kind of making the same types of calls. Turns out that this variance review, it was a great opportunity for us to get all the county planners together in the same room. So all 4 county planners got together with Steve Lubeck and myself. Turns out that regulation only applies to new construction, not to existing structures. And so it was good to see that, all the work that went into putting that process in place is still there and folks are adhering to it. And we're ready to go, for the next time someone does want to build within the floodplain and seeks a variance. We have a process to sort of check that and make sure that, building and development along the river is going slowly at best, right? So that was recently. We have our drought management plan for 2025 that has come out of committee, and we'll go over that. I'll ask our governing board for a vote on that after the steering committee report. I did apply for a designated priority watershed. It was an application that the DEQ put out for their 319 grant program. Every 3 years, basically, they designate a priority watershed, and about half of their 319 grant funding would be prioritized to that watershed. We were not successful in that application. It ended up going to the Shields watershed, and Montana Freshwater Partners will be running those grants. So that's a place that definitely needs a lot of work, and, really, I'll take the hit on that. I could have done a better job on that application. It turned out the timing was not ideal for putting a big proposal like that together. But I think we're in the running. Folks had a lot of good things to say about our work and the consistency of the projects that we've been delivering there at 319 and the DEQ. So lost opportunity there, but we've got enough on our plate as is. So I'm okay with that. We did put out a post, and it's in some of our e-newsletters about recent reports on fish health, just preliminary data that has come out of from some of FWP's studies showing that the fish in the Big Hole are really, really healthy. So just good news from where we were, a couple of years ago with nationwide kind of panic over fish with lesions on their heads and things like that. That doesn't seem to be coming out in the data, at least preliminarily, from what folks are seeing at FWP. Moving on to the groundwater investigation program, we are scheduling our kickoff meeting for early March. I reported out on this before that the groundwater investigation program selected the Big Hole's managed aquifer recharge feasibility project for a 2-year investigation. So we're going to get that off the ground. This is going to be in. So that project, they're going to be investigating the feasibility of a managed aquifer recharge site just outside of Wisdom. Really excited for that. This will be the first of its kind in Montana, and we're happy to be collaborating with the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology on that project. For all you beaver people, the Montana Beaver Working Group annual meeting will be April 1st and 2nd. I believe it's going to be at Carroll College in Helena, and it will also be available on Zoom. I'm a coordinating member of that group and lead the policy working group out of that. Not much more to report there. We're really working on just advancing the possibility of using beaver as tools to enhance watershed resilience across Montana. And there's a lot of ways that we're trying to do that, taking very much, considering that they are also can be detrimental and pests, and in the wrong place, they can be horrible to operations. So we need to learn to live with them and manage them. It looks like the state Montana FWP is moving quickly to get an environmental assessment completed that will allow for translocation of beaver into areas where they can do a lot of good for the landscape. That will be probably presented to the commission this summer. That's looking like the timing for that. So we'll report out as we learn more on that EA. I don't want to go too deep into that rabbit hole for the moment. On the legislative front, I did testify for the RRGL, the DNRC's RRGL grant program. They basically were going to the legislature for funding of their program. This is a program that we have used often. We currently have applications and funding. Well, not us, but Madison County is working on designs for solutions to the Pennington Bridge area through that program. And so we testified on behalf of the program, basically that, it's a good pot of money for us to be using for work that it's really hard to find non-federal sources of money for that type of work. Similarly, Beaverhead County testified for House Bill 7 on the RDG program, which is their mine site related program. One bill that I'm kind of got my eye on, I'm really trying not to dive too deep this early into the legislative session, but House Bill 256 really piqued my interest. This is a one of a kind water storage fund. So as is written right now, it would be $100 million investment by the state of Montana into a trust account, out of which we would pull interest earnings every year out of that principal. 90% of it would go to state-owned water storage projects and 10% to pilot projects and dam inspections. So I think it's about 22 dams that the state of Montana owns and operates. So this would be a fund that allow for regular inspection of those dams and facilities, and then basically a grant program. I think it would be somewhere in the ballpark of $300,000 a year for water storage projects of all types. This would include natural water storage, small reservoirs, anything that could store water for the long term. Yeah, and this would be stable, long-term funding. It's a big injection of money up front and then working off of the principal down the road. On the federal front, you can flip to the next slide. This piece of legislation also caught my eye because I think it does address some things that have been talked about a lot in this room, which is HR 8790. It's called the Federal Fix America's Forests Act. I think it's worth looking into this one. It provides for a lot of simplification and expediting of environmental reviews for forestry related projects, supports seed collection, storage, streamlined use of seeds in restoration for the BLM. It incentivizes biochar utilization and scaling. It proposes to study the possibility of creating a Western headquarters for the U.S. Forest Service. Legally, I think several of you in the room might be interested in this. It tries to get at the amount of litigation that the forest and the BLM have to deal with. So one of the things is lawsuits have to be brought up within 120 days of the public comment period opening. So this would prevent a forest from proposing a project and litigants waiting until the absolute last possible moment to then file a lawsuit, right? So you'd have to bring that lawsuit up within 4 months of it getting open for comment. It would basically kneecap the Cottonwood decision by not requiring reconsultation if new information comes to light on a decision. It would provide for categorical exclusions for thinning around utility lines. I think folks suffering from fires in California and other places, this is probably big news for them. And it restricts litigation by requiring participation and comment by litigants prior to filing a lawsuit. And it allows projects to continue during legal review. So in a lot of ways, I think this is something that folks might want to keep their eyes out. And if you feel like it's something that you want to support, individually might be worth your attention. Okay, we can go to the next one. So quick restoration project update. This is most of the big ones. There's other stuff happening, but I couldn't fit it all on the map. The blue stars here are RFPs that have been put out in the last month and a half or so. We are due to receive applications from a high meadow storage capacity project. So this is engineers or contractors that would be looking, basically doing a GIS aerial exercise to pull out all of the meadow habitats in the Big Hole that could be enhanced for natural water storage through the types of projects that we've been doing quite a bit for the last 8 years or so. This would give us a map and a direction on where we can store water. This is sort of the low-hanging fruit, cheap and easy type of projects. It's the type of projects that the forest has indicated they're very willing to do, and that they have a streamlined kind of NEPA process to be able to do more of those types of projects. So with a project like this, we can really get in front of funders and put a prioritized list and locations of places where we can enhance water resiliency across the watershed. I like to be able to throw someone a map when they say, hey, we've got some extra money. Where can we put this to work? That type of thing really facilitates us keeping great projects going on the ground. In California Creek under Superfund, there's a place we call the demo area. It's basically the first basin along the California Creek Road. We have a mechanized approach that is needed there. It's kind of the last really erosive area under that Superfund project. And we got Water and Environmental Technologies contracted to start a design for that project. And hopefully if they can get the design in time, we can get that work into our scope of work for the fiscal year starting in July, and potentially get that work on the ground while I'm out there in August this summer. For the Smith Springs ditch siphon, we had 4 proposals come in. We had a committee of board members and partners rank those proposals, and Confluence Consulting narrowly won out that contract. That is a contract that currently I can't get it under contract right now, but look forward to getting them going with design as soon as we know more about federal funding and our ability to spend that money. Jumping down to Rock Creek, we awarded R.E. Miller a contract to build a fish barrier there on Rock Creek. This is a priority project of Jim Olson's with FWP, and we took on a future fisheries grant to get that project done. We're looking at an August timeframe on that one. So those are the RFPs. And then I will not go into the weeds on this one, but the Beaverhead Conservation District is going to be putting out an RFP for project management of the Elkhorn project. That is the same project we've been working on for the last 4 years, and we will be bidding on that project and hopefully winning the contract for doing the work that we've done for the last 3 years and will continue to do. I'll leave it at that. It's an administrative head scratcher. As far as projects to be contracted, we have the Elkhorn Preserve project. That's DEQ money, 319 program, where we have I'll show you a slide of what that looks like here at the end. So I'll get into more detail on that one here in just a second. And then Eastern Pioneers, the Forest Service and the BLM money currently is frozen, but we do have $30,000 each from the Mule Deer Foundation and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation to do some conifer encroachment thinning on either forest parcels or adjacent private ground, just knocking back some juniper and Doug fir that are encroaching into grasslands there. So that's on restoration programs. As far as wildlife programs, our carcass composting is set to begin in March. Justin Cottingham is ready to go, and I just got his number up there on the screen. So if you do have a carcass that you need picked up, that's his number. You all know the program, and hopefully we'll take full advantage of it. We're excited to get that. This will be I don't know how many years we've been doing this now, probably a dozen. As far as staffing goes, Kim, you're crushing it. Thank you so much for being here and taking this on. Kim's also been going through our projects, our presentations, and is putting together a lot of higher value science communications about all the work that has been going on in the Big Hole, all the knowledge and understanding that we have about our watershed, water resources, how water is used, how it's moved around. There's a treasure trove, as she will attest to. When you get into our folder structure and our files, there's just so much good information and content that we've been generating over the years, and it always is the last thing that we can make time for. So we're stoked to have Kim with us. Emma Rudzinski is coming back. She was our intern last year, and she's at UC Davis and is going to come back to work with us in the Mount Hagen uplands as an intern, leading a whole bunch of projects there. Same stuff, operation and maintenance of that Superfund site. Okay, we can switch to our next one.
Are you really ready? Are you guys ready?
Are we ready for this? This is the cutest thing that has ever been put on a slideshow at the Big Hole Watershed Committee. Lane Marshall Lynch was born February 13th. So that's part of our staffing update. Tana, you hopefully will not hear anything from her for many weeks as she's raising this adorable little boy and growing her family. So we're trying to give her as much of a break as we can. Look forward to getting her back when she's ready. But the steering committee and I are, going to get her some gifts and some support to just, help her grow her family. It's just awesome. They make cute babies, I'm not gonna lie. All right. And last slide for me. Going into, just wanted to give you a little heads up on this Elkhorn Ranch and Preserve. So this is the old Zucker place just west of Wise River. There's anyone that's floated this section, that there's riparian banks that are, in some spots really devoid of vegetation. I think it's just a long history of grazing without fences. So the owner has decided to, partner with us to get a lot of good work done all in one whack. So we got 319 grant funding from the DEQ to do this work. We're looking at, so there's 6,700 feet of unvegetated banks that we will be plopping willows into, about 900 feet of bank reshaping and sloping, just banks that are just calving off into the river. And then a bunch of 5 total exclosure plots where we're going to try to get cottonwood and aspen established and fence them off completely from browse. Those exclosures will stay in as long as they need to. And then another, and about 1.6 miles of fencing that's going to go in on the lower section there that currently does not have any riparian fencing. So the next steps for us are put together a landowner agreement and get that signed off, and then a grazing management plan where basically the landowner we come up with a strategy for how they're going to use that fence and move their cows in and out. From what I've learned and heard from ranchers in the area, getting cows in there late in the season to kind of clean it off and fertilize it's probably a good idea. So something along those lines will be what the management plan looks like. We're excited to kind of deliver on this project. He's also working with Trout Unlimited and the CCAA program on some irrigation projects of his, getting cold water tributaries to connect all the way to the Big Hole, and some exciting stuff, a lot of possibilities here. And then also in the future, working on the other side of the river there on his pastures and putting in more fencing and riparian vegetation there as well. That's a lot from me, but that's what I've got.
Right. And so
any questions or anything from folks in the room?
You guys have any questions for Pedro?
Does the steering committee have any updates or news they want to share?
Sure. A lot of support. Yeah.
You guys?
Yeah, faith in you, Pedro.
All right. Does anybody else have anything else I'd like to add before we take a break? Yeah.
Pedro mentioned that the program has started on the Wisdom Managed Oscar Recharge Program. I guess that's kind of why I'm here tonight, is to just introduce myself, say hi, my name's Andy Bose. I'll be the lead on that project. We're hoping to have a meeting here in the next couple of weeks. Officially found out a couple of weeks ago myself that I was in charge of it, so we're not too far along, but figured this was a good opportunity to come down and say hi.
Awesome. Nice to meet you. All right, you guys, we'll grab some coffee and some cookies and take a break. Bye. So unfortunately, Brian Wheeler could not make it tonight. So he asked me, he prepared an intro for Brett. So I'm gonna read this intro to you about Brett. And I also did my own online stalking, so he's kind of a cool guy. So if you guys want to imagine me talking like Brian Wheeler from the Big Hole River Foundation, have at it. I can't really impersonate him, but I will read his writing. In 2019, as Big Hole River Foundation was building its water quality pilot program, we also wanted to figure out a way to address concerns over declining bug catches that we were hearing from the public and longtime anglers with decades of anecdotal observation. Because mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies are considered pollution and habitat degradation, evaluation of their relative abundance is often used to evaluate water and habitat quality. Essentially, the bug life is a proxy for the health of all aquatic life. And along with drinking water, irrigation, and recreation, aquatic life is one of the beneficial uses that our rivers are required to support. But beyond simply counting bugs to see whether the famous salmon flies were increasing or decreasing, we sought to build a program that looks at how aquatic invertebrate communities in the Big Hole were shifting in response to water quality, and to examine how water quality impacts biological life. Enter Brett Marshall and River Continuum Concepts. Brett helped us design and implement a macro invertebrate program that amounts to the most comprehensive undertaken in the entire Big Hole. He also conducts all of the exhaustive lab analysis and identification. In October 2024, we completed a sweeping report detailing the first 4 years of that work. Thanks to you, Brett, for taking the time to present on this project and its initiative. And on that, I'd love to introduce Brett Marshall.
So, I'm going to talk to you about our report on the bugs, right? Macroinvertebrates. So, invertebrates are vertebrates that are big enough to be seen by the naked eye, which some people might disagree with what that is, but it's about a millimeter or so at one point in their life, right? So, they can be very, very small. So, dealing with invertebrates, we're not talking about salamanders or amphibians or anything like that. We're talking about vertebrates that I can promise you that this report includes every lobster that's in feeding out. Okay, so I've done bugs for a long time. I've been doing it for 37 years, working on community responses with anthropogenic stressors. The River Continuum Concepts is our name because I managed the bug lab had historically written the River Continuum Cummins and all those other authors. And so it's a play on words from my lab in Philadelphia. My employees, awful lot of experience also. And my follow-up questions.
Snap at me, I'll take two.
Okay, so why macroinvertebrates? Vertebrates are really, really important. I had a friend who was a bear biologist, and we shared a 1937 Living Conservation Corps cabin. He would go out and do his bears in the morning. I'd go out and do my bugs in the morning. We'd get together and have a little fireside beer and stuff in the evening. He had, and I don't think he's being facetious, had a moment where he said, "Do you really think it's smart for you to be a specialized person instead of bug, or you're ever going to find a job?" And I snapped at him because I was defensive, but also because invertebrates are the most diverse animal assemblage in the world. And he was a bear biologist, right? A single species, and entomology covers about 10 to 30 million species. Right? So they're most diverse. Most species are bugs. And he was being facetious when he said, "So what? They're small." They're small, but they're very, very abundant. If you took all of the animals on Earth and weighed them, 97% of the weight would be invertebrates. So that's all of the humans and whales and elephants and fish and everything else on the balance. That much of the weight would be invertebrates. Of that, 90% would be insects. So they're everywhere, and they're very, very important. Besides being fish food, they are important in tidal pathways, right? Breaking down leaves and sticks and all that other stuff when it dies. So that if we got rid of all the invertebrates, right, the tidal pathways, nutrient cycling, and all those things would just come to a halt within about 3 years, according to Ed Wilson, right? There would be no plants except for algae and films. Really, really important. They're most of the species in the human system, and very, very abundant, very, very important. So you really can't understand any harming that system.
Well, you didn't snap at me, Ian.
Okay, so why Big Hole River Foundation? We heard Pedro talk about the big freeze for one, right? So if not Big Hole River Foundation, if not people that are concerned about water, then who, right? The agencies that normally would do this sort of thing are probably not going to do as much. Right? So this sort of organization is very, very important. But also, I found, that this is kind of the same whichever state I live in. Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, right? But this type of monitoring program falls
Did you snap?
between the purview of state agencies. Their state agencies are kind of reactive. FWP has certain goals and certain areas of their management. DEQ has certain goals at monitoring merit criteria, and a lot of other ecology fall similarly to the types of agencies in the states. The River River Foundation was very important. So why macroinvertebrates? I already told you they're important, but beyond fish food, they're excellent community indicators, right? And I want to take this opportunity to address the ecology students. What's the difference between a population and a community?
Yes.
Anyone? Yes. Very close, right? A population are members of the same species, right? So, and communities are groups of population, right? So you can have walleyes, right, in 2 lakes that aren't interbreeding. There would be 2 separate populations of the same species. Communities would be all the other species that are. But we are dealing with community indicators, and it's also kind of backwards from a lot of what people think of ecology, right? So a lot of ecologists would be looking at what is the effect of temperature on stone? What is the effect of temperature on the whole community, right? In this type of monitoring, what we're doing is we're looking at the community and making inferences about other things. So it's kind of backwards ecology. We could have designed studies for different purposes. The population dynamics. Let's say we were interested specifically in the amount of bugs available over the course of a year for fish to eat, right? That would be a different study design. Our goal for this study was to use the vertebrate community as indicators of water quality, habitat quality, barometers of change in water change. So Brian Wheeler and his brave volunteers went out and collected the bugs every fall. We took 3 Hess samplers, kind of a round cylindrical device with a screen in the front, and a net on the back, and you work it down in the sediment, scrub all the rocks, and the river current washes everything into the back, into the net. The net's then removed, and all the samples put in a jar, preserved in alcohol, and delivered to our lab. And then our lab did all the processing. So the goals were to evaluate change in metrics over time. Metrics are going to be things that summarize the composition of the community, right? Not populate. And we looked at how each site changed in some of these metrics over time. And then we looked each year at how they changed among sites, right? In addition to the metrics, we looked at overall taxonomic composition, that's what species live there, using some multivariate methods. And then we also looked at changes in the abundance of dominant species and kind of one species that we kind of love, pale morning dun. We did a lot of statistics to do this, and they're just listed here because some readers to a newsletter thought that maybe we didn't do ours. And it was a newsletter where we don't talk about those methods. But, you know, we used a parametric GLM, ANOVA, a robust ANOVA, a non-parametric ANOVA, test the variance homogeneity, test of normality, non-metric multidimensional scaling, statistical power analysis on our results, and others, right? Next, please. So we did a lot of community metrics. I call these ecological community metrics. They're things that are used broadly in ecology. The number of species, the total abundance of critters, the diversity and community evenness. And then those are used, you know, if you were studying a community of rodents or something, or plants. These other metrics on the left there are measures that were specifically developed for how aquatic communities shift and result in response to anthropogenic disturbance. EPT richness is, of course, the number of different species that are mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. EPT abundance is the relative abundance of those same orders, right? How much of the community is comprised of mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies are a little more sensitive than most of them. Plant chironomedy are the midges, right? Midges get a bad rap. They're really, really important. They account for an awful lot of food, for an awful lot of things. And even though they're very, very small, they're very, very abundant. And a lot of them can complete their life cycle in 3 to 4 weeks during this, right? So it's an awful lot of biomass turnover, right? They get a bad rap because there are some species that are very, very tall, right? And so you'll see a dominance of midges if there's a sewage spill, sometimes, right? They're tolerant, but the actual species of midges range the gamut of environmental tolerance from being very, very sensitive to very, very tolerant. And so we identified each genus. A relative abundance of non-insects, right? They are usually in North American rivers a very, very small portion of the community. Used to be worms and mites and crustaceans and things like that. If you find a lot of non-insects, it usually means something is wrong, whether that is groundwater influence or salinity or temperature. It means something is going on when those increase. North America, African's rivers are dominated by crustaceans. The relative abundance of collectors are how many things are generals, how many things just eat algae or breaking down leaves or all the other functional feeders. The dominant taxon, and the big one is the Pilsonot biotic index, where we take all of the bugs and we take literature values where they're tolerant to organic pollution, which is actually usually co-responsive with other perturbations. And every bug is given that weight, and then its abundance is multiplied through and then divided by the total number of bugs. So we end up with an average tolerance of the whole. And we did all of these with all those statistics, but today we're going to focus on a few select bits of the community stress metrics. So these are the ones, right? EPT richness, it usually decreases. The number of species of mayflies, caddisflies, and stoneflies usually goes down. The relative abundance of those usually go down. The relative abundance of midges usually increases. The relative abundance of non-insects usually increases, and the HBI, median environmental tolerance, usually increases. So this is how I summarized the longitudinal changes. The statistics had a very low amount of power, and I would probably, if I presented every graph in the report from this, we'd waste a lot of time. And so what I did was I ranked them, right? Which site had the worst in each metric, which site had the worst in each year, and then some. So there were 4 years included in this, so if you were the worst site every time, you got, were the worst site almost every time, you might have 5, 6, right? And so it can go up to, if you were the best site, 6, and then 4 years, so you get up to 24 in this. And what you can see with these metrics is that Big Hole at Wisdom is pretty bad in most metrics. So can I have you go forward and then back again?
Yeah, sure.
So, and then if you look at the next one, this is the Hillsnoff Biotic Index, that median environmental tolerance. Again, Big Hole at Wisdom is, again, 4, right? So pull back to the other ones again. The non-insects were not responsive because they were higher at different sites in different years, all the whole time. So they all kind of look the same. So what we can say here generally is that the Big Hole at Jones Hole was often really, really good, and the Big Hole at Wisdom was generally really, really bad because of the quantity. Let's go. So statistical power, I'm not going to talk about this very much, but that newsletter was kind of criticized by the fact that I ignored it when I didn't. So those people showed up. This does have important connotations, right? And the important connotations are, how much of an effect can we detect? One of the things you see ecologists say all the time, we found no significant difference, right? What's that mean? What does it mean if a scientist says there's no significant difference in the community or? Exactly so. And exactly so. And it's most often interpreted as saying, well, there's nothing going on, right? And that is just a sign of a bad study, right? And so we looked at it, and right now, Big Hole River is using 3 samples per stream per day. And at this point, even with our average of variation, it would take a drop from 40 species all the way down to 30, where we actually were able to say there was some other types of things that the graphs I just showed you. 4 samples, right here. And you know, if we went to 5, we'd be able to detect changes. Much preferable. So it's good that one of the things that Brian had to do was make a decision on how to use this information. One of the things he decided to do was to do 1 fewer site per year in order to have better replication at the site. And that's in order to improve some of the weaknesses. Okay, so I present these in the order of downstream to up, right? And this is, and the reason being is that's how we collect. There's no other real reason, right? Water runs down to up, and that's often the case. And at this scale, it wouldn't cause any issues, but normally you want to do that because you sample upstream. So this scale, that's not an issue, but right. So these are the metrics for twin bridges. We call it twin bridges. And because we had very poor power, look at the size of that confidence limit, right? It's huge. But because we had very low power, we really couldn't see significant differences in the EPT richness. However, if you look at the plot of the relative abundance of EPTs, I think you hit it. I think I had
Oh, yeah, there's another one.
Okay, so if you look at that, you can see there was a very significant decline in the relative abundance of mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies at Twin Bridges. And this was probably a little bit exaggerated for two reasons. One being, it started out much higher than normal, right? Normally I see that around 65 and it was almost, right? So it started out high, but it also came up really, really low. The mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies together accounted for less than 20% of the community location activity. And so percents are kind of a funny thing, right? Because one goes up, one goes down, right? So that responses were observed in these two metrics. 33%, about the midges comprise about a third of a percent. Sorry, about a third of the whole system. Abundance of these methods. Right? So usually they were very, very low. But you can see there was an increase over time. The non-insects we like to have less than 20%. You can see they gradually climbed up well beyond that over the course of the year. And that accounted for the reduction of, next slide. This is the ideal range for them, right? So they started out above, went into this particular ideal range, then actually fell significantly below the end of the monitoring area. Next slide, please. And this is the one that integrates them, the Hilsenhoff Biotic Index. These are the same graphs there, just in case we wanted to talk about them. But Hilsenhoff calls streams good if they have less than 4, right? He calls them fair if they have less than 5, and he calls them poor if they have between 5 and 6, right? And so looking at this, you can see a steady progression. This site was never what he would call good, right? But it was over the course of time getting into what he would call not good. Next slide, please. Costa Bridge was very similar to Twin Bridges. And you can see again, very wide variation in EPT richness. This graph, especially at the end. But you see the same, I think we have more little animation here. So you can see the same kind of a trend for the relative abundance of mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies over the 4-year period. They were steadily declining. So they stayed mostly in the window of what we expect to see in a river like the Big Hole, but they definitely declined. The slope was much less than the previous site, but that's partially because lower. They started out around 16% and dropped down to about 27%. It wasn't as extreme, but there's definite reduction. The midges did not change very much. They became highly variable later in the year. That little arrow points at just about the 33% mark, and they're all below that. The worms came up dramatically. They're all well above 20%, right? And that happens most often around here when filamentous algae starts growing, and it acts like a little filter. The little filaments are like this, and the water's flowing through them, and lots of little silt bits get accumulated in there. So these little tiny worms, we're not talking about big earthworms or anything. We're talking about little tiny ligate, 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters long, that have a new refuge. They have a refuge from flow because the flow is reduced in the algae. They have a refuge from predation because a lot of things can't do that. And they have a food resource. So these little worms start becoming one of the dominant, and that's kind of a theme in the river and in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. In this case, the Hilsenhoff Index again, the stream started out below 4%, which I really, really like. It went intermediate in 2021 and 2020. And then a little more, we had one observation where we call it bad, right? But obviously it's not as bad as the previous. Jones Hole, a little less data there because it was sampled a little later. EPT richness was more constant during the time, and we like this to be above 9, right? And just like the others, it was well above it. The EPT relative abundance stayed within that window of ideal mayfly, stonefly, caddisfly abundance during the entire study period. The midges were a little high, especially in the spring. They were way high, but we only did the spring. But the blue bars, the midges were above 30%, not an amount that I'd be really concerned. You know, coastal rivers, I look is around 60%, but 40% is a little high. What we did see is really, really high non-insect abundance. But if you look at the scale of that, it's so small that the scale was exaggerated, right? So they were a little high the first year, but they were low the rest of the year. So this was probably the most stable, least changing site. And this is their Hilsenhoff index. Started out kind of in the good to fair and stayed good, right? Because it was dominated by mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies that have low tolerances to organic pollution. Deep Creek. I always want to call this Duck Creek because it's been you see in another project I have on this Duck Creek. Deep Creek. The richness of mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, pretty consistent, right? The relative abundance of mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies was usually within the range. It dropped pretty severely in 2020. I'm not sure why, but you can't call it really a trend at all because there's an increase after normal in successive years. Midges stayed above the 1/3 mark, and worms were generally below the 20% mark, right? So Deep Creek didn't really respond like something weird was going on. And I think this becomes important when we think about some of the following stuff, in that how should I say this? Their response didn't mirror the others in a way that indicated nutrient enrichment, so that it allows you to kind of throw out some other sources of nutrients like atmospheric deposition or the other sites. This site pretty high should have had, if there were atmospheric signature. Now, one of the things we do see is an increase in a good midge, right? That is, well, okay, making value. So, this midge is a symbiont of blue-green algae nostoc, right? Fishermen, you've always seen them, right? Most fishermen are flipping rocks. And if you see those little dark green, almost black Mickey Mouse ears on the rocks, right? This one particular midge only occurs as a symbiont in that algae. And in fact, everyone that looks like a mouse ear has one of these little midges. Otherwise, so that tends to indicate if blue-greens become a dominant member of the community, right? It tends to indicate that nitrogen isn't a limiting factor, is a limiting factor in their growth, because the blue-greens spend energy to fix their own nitrogen, right? That's a use of energy that would make them uncompetitive if it wasn't. Right? So I didn't bring up all of the functional feeding pie charts for this talk. That is something that kind of supports what I'm saying. And the Hilsenhoff biotic index, except for the year where the midges were high, was all in the good category. Okay. This is a big hole at wisdom. And first of all, this is the only one where we're really, really concerned about the species richness of the EPT, right? In this region, they only get down to 9 if something bad, I'm going to use what's going on, right? And you can see most of the time they were below 9, right? And if you look at the, I think one more, I think there's a little rectangle coming down, right? So that's the range, the scale's different on this one, but if you look at the relative abundance of EPTs, that's what we'd expect it to be. And every year the fall samples were well below the proportional abundance of mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies that we'd like to see. And why? Well, it wasn't really the non-insects. They were a little high, but the midges were really, really high. And the midges that were there were really hard to identify because there were some filamentous algae feeding midges, which were in the genus Protopus. And so Protopus and Orthopladius are really, really similar midge genera. They each have about 100 known species and over 100 unknown species. They're very, very similar. But the take home is that those were the creatures that were dominating algae. And then another weird bug that occurred there was the microcaddis flies that have macrophyte piercing mouthparts, hydroptilla. So the whole system here is driven primarily by filamentous algae. So those are all the bad missions. Okay, I'll pass judgment on this one. The evidence starts being. Next slide, please. And you can see in 2021, the average pollution tolerance was right on the 6.0 line of this site is consistently looking like it's disturbed by some kind of enrichment. And the last site, EPT richness was good, well above 9, right? Highly variable, no significant differences. The EPT abundance was low, right? It was not as low as Big Hole of Wisdom, but it was low at most sites in most dates. The amount of midges were high, and the non-insects were also high. Same response signature as BHW, but a little less pronounced, but definitely a little, and the same species. So with the filamentous algae like prisms. Dominated. And then the Hillsmont Biotic Index, the site scored a lot better. Most of them being in the intermediate range. So then switching gears from metrics to the overall taxonomic composition and some general ideas about the multivariate approach. So this is kind of an example to get you thinking about how this type of statistic works. Right? And what you would have is along one axis, you have one species, and on the other axis, you have another species, right? And then what you would do is, okay, so if there were like 5 and 12 of those species, they would come out there and there, right? So the samples are looked at by the abundance of all the species. And so this would be really, really neat if we only had 2 species. But it's a more complicated system. So if you would imagine this wall being that graph, right, where you have species 1 going along the floor, species 2 going up along the wall, and you'd go, this many is species 1, this many is species 2. When you add a third species, that's this right here, right? Those dots on the wall become tennis balls floating in the room, right? And so what we're doing is evaluating the distance between the tennis balls floating in the room. We have 3 species, but we had 107 species. So it's a little more mathematically tricky to deal with that. And we use the method called The next slide, please. Non-metric multidimensional scaling to do that and then project some planes, not always linear planes anymore with this method, but anyway, planes. And the planes that describe the greatest amount of variation are running that way. And the planes that describe the second amount of variation are running that way. These multiple planes, because I say the word planes because it's actually an axis that's linear, right? So a lot of people will put these up and then say, well, look, this is different from that, and this is different from that. But we went a step further and looked at the species levels. So Glycinic Flavolinia, Glossinia sebulosa, Hesperophylla pacifica, Rithyrogena, Paranarcis, Rhycophila, Arctopsecti grandis, right? These are all bugs that I think the fly fishermen might know. They all pull the community structure this way, right? A few others that are kind of good water bugs would be Brachiocentrus occidentalis, Brachiocentrus americanus. They pull the samples up, but they also pull it a little bit this way, so they have a net that effect. What makes them different from all these other EPDs pulling things this way is that they're actually fine filtered. Brachiocentrus and others they pass and sister Brachiocentrus americanus. They have on their camera these little tiny cones. You can look at them, right? They have a square case cross section, and they take a little silk and then they spread those legs like this. And little bacteria-sized particles get stuck in them. And if there's a mayfly, somebody look there, because their legs grab it. But generally, they're eating bacterial-sized particles that get trapped on the zero. And the reason I'm telling you that, because Riotane tarsus is also a fine filter feeder. Simulium is also a fine filter feeder. Right? Microtubules is also a fine filter feeder. So the fine filter feeders are pulling things up and that way most. Right? And so the biggest influence going that way were the small ones that I was talking about earlier. But also Cane tarsus, which is a major, very solid sediment. They build really loose, fluffy, my technicians call them chicken breading. Build these little kind of loose, fluffy pieces and they pack them up like condos for an station. Riotane tarsus midge is also out this way. Most of these, so things that hold things this way very strongly were the bugs that are more tolerant to sedimentation, benefiting from sedimentation. And the ones that got pulled down here were clean sand and clean rocks. Right? So, and up here a little bit, you get some pulling of these old stemophyll planes, but you'd also, you swing up a little bit harder, you start getting images that like algae. Right? So now looking at this and the sites, all these blue ones, fingerings, right? There were a lot of algae midges, right? But you mentioned that there was a little bit less of that going on Tulsa Bridge, which comes out over here. BHW comes out over here in the sediment tolerant part. So does Jackson, comes out over there. One of the weird things, Mead Creek comes out down here with clean rocks, but it's the sum of the species, right? Microtubules rhydolensis was only in Mead Creek, whereas its sister, Microtubules pedalus, was in the whole river. So just because that one species doesn't have a lot of impact, but it's the sum of all the species that pull these bugs right and left. Okay, so where are the mayflies at, right? This study was not designed to evaluate a single species, right? It was designed to take whole communities and summarize them and make correlations to water quality and habitat. But I'm sure there's a big interest in mayflies when you're talking about the Big Hole River. And so, again, our study didn't have a lot of power to look at this. So these are the medians of the medians. And so the median abundance of ephemeral excrucians, the pale morning dun, was a median of 60 per sample, right? So if you multiply that by 10, you have the number per square meter. So 600 per square meter at BHW, 220 at Jackson, only 30 or 300 per meter at Twin Britain. But the one that stands out is Jones Hole, where we have 1,550. I'm sorry, Hill Morning Duns, or which would be about 15,000 per square meter. Right? Now, that's not per square meter like a heat, right? They're not covering it like, you know, like some kind of creepy horror movie. They're in like a top 10, 15. So finally, I like to try to put something in the report that isn't just. I wanted to give Big Hole River something that would speed this report. I donated an awful lot of time, 75% of the time donated, which meant we had to fit in around other projects. And so it takes a while to get these reports. And so I developed from these data using box plots on the metrics and the thresholds that I already know for the came up with screening tools so that when we report the data in subsequent years, Big Hole River Foundation can quickly look at them and say, "Oh my goodness, this site's got." Instead of waiting for something to do. Can we have the next slide?
Sure.
And this is what an example is. This is the criteria for Jones Field, right? So we want to see at least 35 species of invertebrates, right? If we find between 35 and 27, we'd say there's maybe something going on. And if we ever see less than 27 there, we're going to say that's very deviant from our path. I'm not saying good or bad, but the same. That's very important. The community evenness, we didn't talk about that one, but this is all the metrics that we provided stuff on. And we had to choose that one or diversity. And since diversity is a combination of richness and evenness, we chose to use the composite measures separately. So community evenness is this idea that if you put all the bugs in a hat, I don't know why you would do that, but if you did that and you reached in and randomly pulled out a bug and you said, "Oh, this is species A," what's the probability of pulling out species A again? And so a community that has a lot of members, a lot of different species, high evenness. One, every species had the exact abundance. One, if you have a community where there's only a few things living there, and everything else is struggling, find 100 of this and 2 of everything else is going to be very low. So we rated it for that. EPT richness, we already talked about the number of species. Jones Hole had relatively high, so we'd like to see it stay above 17 species. Minor deviation, 17 to 13. If we ever have less than 13, right, we're going to say definitely that's still better than our regional impairment ideal of less than 9. We want to keep EPT relative abundance was high in all of these sampling years at Jones Hole. And so we want to be sure it stays high, but it did get down, to 45%. So we want it to stay above 45. If it ever gets below 38%, we're going to say that's a major deviation. And you can see the others. I don't need to explain the rest of how those criteria, the screening criteria, Big Hole River Foundation.
So, no, it's
So conclusion, like Russian conversations, get over with. They don't need to hear the same thing over and over again, right? So let's just move on to questions and comments and talk about goals and alternatives. and designs.
How did you determine what bugs should be?
I didn't do it that way. Right, because our sample design wasn't designed to evaluate any individual. So what I did do was, I did the bugs with the Ulster National Park and for counties and mountain. So they could also do the Omen. Lot of bugs using vaccine that. So the idea of there being is nine is based on yeah.
And so with the sampling, with that, it was taken at a certain point in time.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder that.
And then how do you, like, all the bugs have different lifespans, so how do you know that what you're collecting is an example of the population of the community?
Yeah.
As a whole, and not just like in between dioxin, like.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So bugs have on cold blooded, but maybe that's judgment. Their life cycles are controlled by right, so what entomologists do evaluating the growth of bugs is we standardize them to 3 days above physiological. And so let's just say that above, and usually it's freezing, that's 0 degrees. Right? Because we don't always know. Right? So if you standardize them on years of an individual species, let's say you were looking at chips or something like that, you would always re-standardize it back to the number of 3 days every year to be sure you're turning. With these communities, it's really hard to do, right? So what we try to do is try to do it as consistently as possible, okay? But also during periods of low emergence, right? So the Henry Ford Foundation that I do this for, they took this to schools that we go out on St. Patrick's Day every year, which Henry Ford is no shooting over 30 feet of snow. But there's no emergencies going on, right? So everything that's there survived the previous year and into the winter, right? It's an excellent way to weed out unwanted sources. By the other hand, we are doing it in the late fall. There's a reduction in the amount of emergencies that we hear, but there are still some. I'm sure everybody's seen. The advantage of doing it in the fall is that you get to see, right? And so that, and you don't have to snow shoot, what the bugs like down on the water. So the only way we control for that in this study is through doing it some theory that should be the things that come out that year usually have asynchronous larval development, right? So they would be coming out on and off during the night. By using richness measures, those are abundance and that's probably.
Just thinking about doing it in September. Would that be the? Because that's your lower flow.
The big one, well, yes. So remember the bugs that emerged in June laid eggs in June, right? So there's still, and that's not a hard and fast rule, it's something. So they had a lot of stone flies and heads. So they emerge in the spring, right? And they're from smaller. They lay their eggs. But the eggs are like really tiny. They wait for the chance to line up. It's not like they're constantly doing periscopes or anything like that, but the way that their life cycles are is that they have a big diamond, right? So the is okay. So they are notorious for having a kind of delayed rise. So with their eggs, you let them all hatch. Pigeon driven. Early something later. What's the question again?
That's your lowest flow.
What would they do to the bugs? I think a lot of them are something that need it, right? But smaller and harder to see. But what you should see there is, in terms of the bigger, is that they are the bugs that survive the sun. They cannot be made. They're still there and losing. Exposed, all the oxygen, all of it. It's not necessarily the best. We started this example in spring and try to get around it, right? As much as I hate snowshoeing, you shouldn't say a lot of people like it. In waders and carrying you anyway, as much as it's really fine. The whole River Foundation really had to prioritize the resource, which one was more important, and for them getting this that something before we. Yeah, but I'm sure that had. We touched on something that shows up here, although kind of backwards. Right? The spring sampling had a very different result than fall. But it wasn't the kind of thing that you would think, right? In this case, it had more vision, right? The images were I'm not sure why there were more there. Maybe it's because a bunch of great guys and stuff was not warm. Like they were doing those in April by the time, right? So there are some emergencies that we're just getting out there before there were emergencies. And so they tried to be, but yeah, there will be different results in these metrics, which is why all the baselines that I developed based on also.
We've got 4 years of data, so how many years do you make an inference of
Right.
trend?
Yeah.
And then
So, yeah. So, I personally feel weird about doing it with not enough data, not enough years, right? So imagine if you have, you know, 2 months a month, right? It's always, right? It doesn't matter, right? If they're here, it's a trend, that will be, or people. And if it's 3 years, right? The same sort of thing, right? You could have either all of them going up, or all of them going down, or going up and going down, or going down and going up, right? It's like there's either a trend or there's not, and it could all just be random acid variation. So I wouldn't take any trend seriously until there's 6 years of data. However, they did get around this a little bit by having references, right? So that we know that the averages are different among them. Right? So, which is probably more useful than just, because you can model it with nutrient or temperature. Just because temperature is generally increasing over time, right? So having the average, and there are a number of ways to improve the time. You use a flow strategy, a lot of variation in needs based on water versus substrate. Or is it something we control for that? Evaluate it. A lot of different stuff that we can do, but a 4-year trend, I wouldn't say is a big trend. So in the report, we didn't do just like regressions on these. Or this is each section, and even defining that it's probably better to use alpha 21 because if we increase the power, really 90% sure that the difference isn't that really better than saying we want to divide the 90 and missing. So, but that said, the changes at Cambridge and mayfly abundance were very dramatic, for being very, very high, being very, very low, and incrementally along the gradient with replication. And is that going to be trend in the future? That trend is only probably going to become less, right? Because it's really hard to drive EPGs below 20. You know, they were like 19, right? It's like, how are you going to get rid of all of them? That's going to be a much slower process, right? You have to have very good mayflies, right?
You actually have a question from the Zoom chat. Abby Ebert from Montana DEQ was asking if the Big Hole River Foundation thought of looking at correlations between the macroinvertebrate data and the nutrient algae data.
Yes,
Data.
they have thought.
Okay.
Absolutely. And this, in fact, I think they're waiting till years because just by undersampling alone, we might miss some, right? So yeah, in fact, this study was designed in a way to help. Right? There are a lot of other vertebrate screening tools, and they don't use replication. And the idea here is that streams are very variable. And so based on flow, based on accumulation of materials, so we have multiple that type of variation. A lot of the screening tools used by a lot of agencies try to collect all that stuff and then only do one sample. They're going to do one sample. And what I find in those cases is that we use about 1/3 of a sample because the sample organisms, and so really they're making the whole based on about a square inch and a half, which is not really a good way to do that. So this study design was actually set up. We could try to do that. Now there are ways we could still do it better, absolutely, but we wanted to have the flow stratification, substrate characterization in each sample, which would really, really make it harder for Brian to. It would also make it really, really expensive. In order to control for this, the more variables you add to the equation, the more samples you have, right? It's kind of the statistical law, right? And so if we were to expand it that way, we would probably need 10 replicas, which would really limit the state applicability. But yes, her question, absolutely, yes, that is.
Okay, awesome.
So we're just finding at the moment on the last meeting, and we talked about algae bloom. You said we were really bad through the site, and you see like a correlation between species numbers and specific algae blooms?
Yeah, yeah, every time I said something about algae, it was about performance algae, which would be the blooms he's talking about. So he's not talking about the chronic algae blooms of lakes or the algae blooms. He's talking about performance algae. And so what we found a shift from the non-stop language. Something correlates with when we find the largest, the obviously, large algae, either one that we've done that, when we find the microcaterpillars that are stuck, sauce, there's lots of the ones that really correlate with yeah, the bugs are pretty neat for corroborating the findings of the other aspects. It's just one line of evidence, of course, but probably.
How does they like environmental event? How long, like, it's like a rebound.
Oh, boy. Now,
Like, I know it's very big.
yeah, no, that's a great question. It's a very deep question. Some of the underlying biological monitoring, right? And traditionally, the assumption in most bioassessment designs that states a lot of federal agencies is that insects have such a high reproductive capacity that doesn't matter, right? The assumption is that I can produce, every individual can produce hundreds, maybe thousands of eggs, right? And so we're going to start over with insect. I don't know if that assumption is actually valid. So, science, right? That is a really interesting question. The general assumption is that they reset, and that makes them independent individuals. But when it comes to a point where there's a lot of reduced survival of a lot of species, then maybe that's not true. Right? And I think there's a lot of evidence that might be, right? Anybody driven along the Big Hole lately? That's driven along it 20 years ago? What's your windshield looking like? I don't know. You just have to use a gallon of windshield washer fluid to get through it, right? There's a lot less bugs flying around, which means there may be a lot less food, right? So another potential that we're working on is for example, data is that Gilmer and Guns, we have numbers that are but the same phenomenon spotted on the or the reduced hatching. Very serious problem. This work is people come from South Africa, New Zealand, and all over the world for this incredible hatching. Right? They don't come there just for the river, they come there for this hatching. If never is obfuscating the use of emergent, that not only reduces those hatchings, also reduces the probability of development. They only live 24 hours as adults, right? And so the whole idea of having these highly synchronized emergencies is so that we'll live very long, but let's find an eight really fast. And so, kind of like Maloney's. So yeah, so that's a really serious question. We not address it, but we are looking at that somewhat. So that is most likely not just a big thing, right? It's greater Yellowstone. Really good.
All right, well, thanks, Brett, for coming out.
I couldn't hear from here, but did Brett get a good round of applause there from folks?
Yes, he did.